Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm looking at how we can use behavioural science to solve so-called wicked problems. As the name implies, wicked problems, things that aren't easy. They're social, cultural and business challenges that are difficult or maybe even seem impossible to solve because of their complex and interconnected nature. Wicked problems lack clarity in their aims and solutions and are subject to real-world constraints, which hinder risk-free attempts to find a solution. And many of the challenges that we face when we're mitigating human risk are, or at least appear, to be wicked problems. So why on earth would someone go out and try and tackle these? Well, that's a great question, but my guests Koen Smets and Dr. Bart Derre are not put off by this. They're up for the challenge, which is why I thought they'd make fascinating guests. Koen is well known in behavioural science circles. Many of you will have read his blogs or followed him on social media, where he goes by the name of Confucius. Dr. Bart Derre, his partner, is the director for the Centre for Entrepreneurship at the University of Applied Science in Ghent. Both bring a rich background in combining academia with consultancy, and they offer unique insights into how behavioural science can solve complex organisational problems. In our discussion, we explore their collective journey, their approach to effective entrepreneurial education, and the methodologies that they use to tackle wicked problems in organisations, including in one case, a compliance challenge. Throughout the episode, you'll hear about their innovative techniques, the importance of self-regulated learning, and how they blend scientific principles with practical applications to drive meaningful change. I'm fascinated by anybody that's trying to tackle big problems, and this conversation is no exception. Before we begin, just a note to say that we did have a few audio issues when recording this episode, but as ever, I hope that high-quality content can compensate for the occasional lapse in the quality of the audio. So please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Koen and Bart on leveraging behavioural science to solve wicked problems. Koen and Bart, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Glad to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have both of you here. And I think to start us off, why don't we get you to introduce yourself to my listeners? So Bart, why don't we start with you? Just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself.
Okay, my name is Bart. I'm currently the director of the Centre for Entrepreneurship at the University of Applied Science in Ghent. And I've been combining academia the past 24 years with consultancy. Started as quality, used to be a quality manager of a hospital, and then changed to behavioral change. So, and that been doing that together with Koen for the past, I think, Koen, the past 10 years.
Yeah, from before pandemic.
And in the meantime, last year, 52, I obtained my PhD at the Eindhoven University of Technology.
Congratulations.
Lifelong learning on the topic of effective entrepreneurial education. And entrepreneurial education is also about changing behavior. And we wrote a book together 6 years ago, and it was in Dutch, and it was called the Entrepreneurial Organization. So you see that what I'm doing in academia, doing in organizations, and vice versa.
Love it. And Koen, many of my listeners will know you already, but for those that don't, just give us a little pen portrait of yourself.
Yes, so maybe I'll make the link with how people might know me. I'm my online persona is Confucius. I have been writing a blog on behavior for nearly 10 years, I think. In fact, probably just over 10 years. It started in 2014, so to 2024, it's 10 years. I didn't even realize, but it's been 10 years. I started life as an engineer and did engineering stuff, but then rolled into technical consultancy, and from there in more general management consultancy, where initially I was sort of involved in what was then called a business process re-engineering. So the engineering thing spoke to me, I thought, but what really got me going is the human aspect, because as an engineer, you can design systems, and as an organizational engineer, you can design organizations, but it's the people that make it work or not. And that then really got me interested. Why people not behaving in the way that you expect them to be? You build an organization for them to populate and to work with. And so this was late last century. But then in the beginning of this century, I sort of got interested in economics and particularly in behavioral economics, and I could see an opportunity for applying insights and concepts from behavioral economics in organizations, and started doing that gradually more and more. And these things really helped. Looking at what motivates people to do certain things or against certain things. And so how can you formulate the messages about the desired behavior so that people take to it more than find ways for not doing it, those kind of things. And so behavioral economics started gaining traction in the late 2010s. And so that's when this whole idea really started taking off. Also my online activities, mostly on Twitter. And that's how I met Bart. I have to say, this entrepreneurial behavioral thing wasn't quite where my focus lay, but it clicked online. I mean, we discussed things online and then decided to organize a training course together without ever having met physically. And that worked really well. And it kind of then started us off on this book on entrepreneurial behavior, where Bart came from the idea of delegating decision-making to people on the floor, as it were, because they generally know much better how things work than people 2, 3, 4 layers higher up. And that fitted really well in my perspective on behavior and decision-making within organizations. Just to conclude my sort of thumbnail bio, since 2019, and also through a connection via Twitter, I've been teaching a course on ethical evidence-based decision-making at St. Louis University with a colleague, Matt Grawich. So I'm now in my 6th year there. It's really, really interesting to teach the kind of stuff that you're interested in, because it keeps you on your toes, and it's the best way of learning about behavior and decision-making. But then Bart and I decided there was an opportunity for us to work together from both our angles. And that's how our company, The Bee, came into existence. And so we've been working on basically developing our approach to behavioral change in a range of different contexts. And as you already alluded to in our little pre-podcast recording chats, really quite wicked problems that people face in organizations, and where conventional approaches don't really work a lot.
So it seems to me that both of you are curious people, by which I don't mean strange. I mean just intellectually curious, and you love solving problems. I presume that's what it is that attracts you to difficult things, because there are plenty of opportunities to deploy behavioral science and behavioral thinking in relatively simpler use cases. If I look at advertising, marketing, for example, not your area of specialism, but there are easier things you could have chosen to tackle. And my sense, given the way you both talk about it, is that you're up for a challenge and you like slightly more complex problems than maybe the average person might want to tackle.
I think we are both looking for indeed some complexer issues and trying to look at through a kind of also academic glasses, because in consultancy there's a lot of business that's really saying what the customer wants to hear. So we try to not only look at complex problems, but also to try to help the organization and not only the manager that pays the bill. So that makes it even more complex in the sense. So and you're right, changing behavior in complex and big organization is difficult. Even in EMEA, professionals, it makes an extra complexity layer.
Yeah, I think what Bart is saying there, and also I think the urge we have to look for scientific underpinning of what we propose. Well, we don't just sort of make things up or cherry pick things that sound good, but look for really sound evidence for what we propose. And we are indeed looking for what is sometimes known as wicked problems in organizations, where you don't have a straightforward linear path from defining the problem to solving it. It's often iterative. And I think that perhaps characterizes our approach as well. We don't typically say, okay, well, we'll do a diagnostic phase and sort of work everything out and then design some kind of structure for the solution. work out the detail, and then implement it. We move into implementation much earlier. As soon as we have a rough idea of where the pain really lies in an organization, we start moving. And we do sort of almost simultaneous further refinement of our understanding of the problem, but also beginning to test ideas for addressing the problem. And I think that is quite different from the way conventionally problems are solved.
And so this is almost the antithesis of, if I look at, say, the way people like McKinsey work, where they come up with a hypothesis, often a hypothesis that they're hired to produce a specific answer, and it's go look for information that validates that. You're approaching it much more experimentally, I guess, to the extent of sort of coming in, there's a problem to be solved. We don't know what the answer is, and we're going to play around, not in an unsophisticated, childish way, but in a scientific way. We're going to experiment a bit, see what happens, and I guess find our way to an answer that way. Is that the good way to look at it?
Yeah, well, the methodology that we use is really a design science research methodology. And it was Herbert Simon who pitched it first, also one of the fathers of behavioral science, I think. So in design science methodology, we focus on really trying to solve a field problem. And the way that we do it is really try to look at to make a quick design, implement it, and also use a data-driven system so that we can monitor not only if the intervention works, but really in changing behavior, what contextual and structural elements do we need to change on the basis on the feedback of the people who are doing the behavioral change. So instead of analyzing for months, trying to look at the root causes, as we learned in quality management, we know that wicked problems and complexity theory tells us also, you can't really analyze it as you want. There's always some causes that are linked together or are not on the surface, or people are not telling you in interviews before the intervention. So what we try to do is indeed go to a quick design, use a data-driven methodology, and change iteratively, and so go further in changing behavior and trying to scale it up as we go.
Yeah, I think what Bart is saying there about quality management resonates with me as well from an organization development perspective. The almost axiom that there must be some root causes, we're going to dig until we find them, and we fixed them. And I think just as in quality in organizations, which is my background, organization development, it is rare for the problem really to have deep roots. It is much more common for the organization to have inadvertently raised obstacles to the desired behavior. And I think this design science methodology is really well suited to discover where those obstacles really lie from the people on the ground. And that is why it is so important to start working with those people straight away, rather than through surveys and questionnaires find out where people think those root causes might lie. So it's much more hands-on, not just for us as the consultants, as it were, but also for the people involved on the ground in how their day-to-day activities are being hindered by organizational structures. As an OD consultant, I've always sort of felt that organizations are a necessary evil. I mean, you can't have hundreds or thousands of people working without any organization, but it needs to almost be invisible, and it should certainly not make life hard for people. And this allows us to address both aspects of organizational change simultaneously. One is the behavior. So what are people doing? What should they be doing? Why are they not doing what they really ought to be doing? And at the same time, look at what structural aspects, both in processes and procedures and in organizational structure, are preventing them from doing what they need to do.
Yes, I think that's really the big difference that we try to make is that, as we all know, is that behavior is the individual within a context. So I think the most consultancy, and I used to do that also, we first look at the context, we change context, we implement big change programs. Is it agile or other big transformation, and then we think that the individual adapts to those structural changes. We are all a lot frustrated, and that doesn't happen. So what we try to do is start with the individual change, but also take the context wherein behavior is done as a consequence. Once our intervention is implemented, look on the basis of the feedback, what we need to change in context and procedures. That's a little bit the different route we take with our approach.
And so typically you're looking at, there's an organizational desired outcome that's not occurring. And it sounds as if in many cases, what you've got is somebody somewhere has designed something either to address that specific challenge or maybe to do something else that impedes this other objective. In other words, what you're looking at is either unintended consequences of a process that's looking at something else, or if there's a specific solution to this problem, it's not working out. But either way, there's a human somewhere along the line, or several humans that have designed something, and somewhere in that design is a flaw. And it may be that they weren't contemplating this particular issue. They may be focusing on something else. But either way, we're not getting to the point that we need to get to. And so really, when I look at this in a human risk lens, in simple terms, this is a failure of design. And therefore, you've designed a world that's producing not the outcome you want, but a different one.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think it's not always fully a consequence of a deliberate design, because even when you do start off with a design of a particular structure or a particular process. I mean, let's take compliance processes, for instance. We've worked in pharmaceutical industry on this. There are certain boundary conditions. There are certain processes that are imposed from outside. But there are a lot of ad hoc bolt-ons that often don't even have that status. People don't realize these aspects have been added. It's just how people have been interpreting the way things are intended in their own specific context. And so it's a combination of a design system and the ramifications of rolling out a system in a complex organization. And so the best and the fastest way of identifying those obstacles is to engage with the people who run into those obstacles every day.
So you're going effectively, to sort of use military terms, you're going to the battlefront or the factory floor or whatever it is.
Yes.
And saying, let's have a look at not what you wanted to have happen, but actually what is happening. What's the result of the structures you've imposed?
Yeah.
And we'll go and analyze those. And so that's the focal point is really on the ground, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it is an element of it could be lack of knowledge. So people have partial knowledge, completed with assumptions or rumors or bits that they picked up from colleagues, but which are not quite right. And so one of the things you then focus on, well, how do you know what you need to know? And then people say, well, I don't actually know how I know what I need to know. So, okay, then you can provide them with knowledge. And I think an important aspect of our approach is what is called self-regulated learning, which means that in contrast with the conventional way of learning and development and training and education in organizations, where people once or twice a year talk with their supervisor about what training courses would be appropriate for them. And then they go on a training course for a few days or for a week, and they come back to their place of work. And there is no immediate need to apply that knowledge. And so within a few weeks, it starts fading away. The self-regulated learning is basically driven by the need when it arises and where it arises. And so through this sort of really tight, short feedback loops, we can guide participants in such intervention towards the relevant information when they need it. And as you know, when you have a question and then the answer is provided straight away, they get linked very, very closely. When you do it more conventionally, you give people information and hope that somehow they will match it to a question when it arises for them. You are much less effective in transferring that knowledge.
And I love this because I think that there are so many examples in the world where training is done for the convenience of the people organizing it. So we'll do it on a cadence that means we can tick the box, or we want everybody to do the training at the same time. Induction training, let's push everything we can at people on day one, when the last thing they want to be doing is having training. You know, they're worried about, have I made a good decision with my job, rather than I'm interested in learning about this stuff. And you're moving it to what we might say, I guess examples would be, for example, airline safety briefings. You know, I always say that we don't send people a YouTube link 6 months before you get on a plane.
Yep.
We give you the safety briefing just before the plane takes off, which is when it's most relevant, and you're sitting in the seat, so it's got the greatest opportunity to land, pun intended. But you're going a bit further than that and saying, actually, what we're trying to do here, I think, is get hold people's natural curiosity and want to know, desire to learn things. If we can tap into that at the right time when they're asking questions and they want understanding, we're more likely to succeed in our learning. Or we're likely to get the message across to them, and they're more likely to retain it. Is that the right way to look at it?
Yes, it's a combination of three things. It's a combination of self-regulated learning, but also activity-based learning, deliberate practice and feedback. So maybe the airline example is a good one. We try to put people in a kind of a simulator. So we give them tasks to do the behavior that the organization wants to see. Because that's our first question when we come to an organization. Our first question is, what's your strategy? And what are the behaviors that are really delivering or contributing to the strategy? And so if you know what the really important behaviors that people need to do in the important jobs that needs to be done, if you know those behaviors, you can train them. So you can give tasks so that you train the behavior, read in self-regulated behavior and feedback, and you see that people start to engage and learn. You activate really a self. It's instead of a pushing, people are pulling their own learning. That's what we are doing. So
just unpick that self-regulated piece for me, because what you're basically saying is the best people to work out what they need to know are the humans that need to know it.
Yeah. So our theory base the idea of self-regulated. There's a lot of theory about it, but our concept is that of Zimmerman, who did a lot of work on self-regulated behavior. So it's all about really looking at the goal you need to set, knowing if you can reach, what are your weaknesses and strengths to reach the goals? What do you need to learn to achieve the goals? And once you've learned it, check if indeed your performance is better. So that's in a nutshell what we are trying to activate by giving people tasks. For example, if you ask people, check your compliance rate, really give them the exercise and get into conversation with the results that you are giving them and repeat it over several weeks. It seems very basic, but it's really the basis for further learning, deeper learning that you can get with people. So it's really stepping back and step for step, helping people to reach their own self-regulated learning, that they do their own learning at the moment that they need it. Because it's not something that some people say, okay, we have all the material online. Why aren't people using it? Why do they not know that they need to learn something? Then you get the boxes. So if you can have people in your organization who know their own weaknesses and strengths in relation to the goals they need to achieve, then they can do the necessary learning and help for them on their own.
And so in essence, what you're doing is you're exposing people to the problems that they need to solve and helping them to work out where the gaps are.
Yeah. One of the underlying mechanisms that we used.
And so this is quite, in a way, I mean, I love it, right? Because it's trusting the individual to recognize their own weaknesses, allowing them to do that and saying it's safe not to know everything. And we're gonna fill your time with things that are relevant, not relevant theoretically to the job, but relevant to your level of expertise and experience in that job. And so this is tailor-made for you. as opposed to you just being treated like a generic employee that has to do standardized stuff?
I think that's right on the ball, Christian. It is tailored to every single individual because every person will have a different profile of what they know, what they're experienced in, what is new to them, what they think, what they understand, but actually don't fully understand. So they are given the context and the tools and access to materials to fill in their personal gaps in knowledge and ability and skill and experience. And so they basically, when they run into an obstacle, it's up to them to try and find out why they don't know or why what they try to do doesn't work. And then they, through this sort of really tight weekly feedback loop, we can then test, okay, well, have you asked a colleague? Have you asked with one of the experts in the organization? Have you looked online? What else? Is it maybe, are you waiting for information from somebody else that you don't get? Do you know how to engage with people who need to provide you with the information that is needed? And so it is almost one-on-one coaching without the effort that normally goes with that one-on-one coaching, because the learning individual is always in the driving seat and is always driven and guided by their need in the moment in their particular work context.
So you're, in a way, you need a bit of psychological safety around this, right? Because one of the benefits of a traditional structure, and I use benefits in inverted commas, is that people can hide. Both the organization can hide behind, we've given everybody training, we don't need to worry about the individual people because they've all got it. And the individual can kind of go, I don't need to think too hard, right? I've done all this stuff and I have no agency in this space. What you're talking about here is probably an explicit admission on the part of the organization that people are going to be at different stages, which is obvious, but they're going to be at different stages. And even theoretically, if they ought to know something because of their experience or whatever, maybe they just don't. They've never picked it up before. You can close that gap. And so I think this is a really human thing because we all know there's things that, our age or whatever ought to, or experience in a particular industry, we ought to know this, but we don't. And I think what's interesting is in a world that is changing, there are always going to be things that we need to refresh because it's been a long time, or that the fundamentals may have changed.
Yep.
And so I like this idea of being, what you're pointing towards here is a much more honest approach to training, which sort of says, actually, we're not programming robots, we're training human beings, and let's spend that time and effort on things that really matter. But that requires us there's a bit of a psychological leap, I guess, for the part of the organization to say, okay, we're prepared to go down this route, because this requires you to trust the individuals to be able to do their own self-assessment, for you not to be worried, because it's very easy to say, well, everybody's done the training, right? Sounds really good, except it's not. We know that. So I quite like this, but this is quite an adult, if I can use that term, way of looking at the world.
It is.
Absolutely, because also we need to take in the leadership that participates in this training. So the feedback that people are giving during the training are picked up by leadership that is taking part in the training. So you could describe it as a kind of a multi-level training. So it's not a training that they say, okay, consultants come in, do the training, we will stand on the side, and once the training is ended, tell us how it went. No, we co-create the training with the organization. We pull in leadership on a weekly basis to listen to the feedback and give feedback. So that's also one of the issues that we often see, is that giving feedback on the feedback the employees give, is difficult. And managers get a lot of information of their own blind spots, because they say, why didn't they check compliance, the way it's in the procedures? And then we ask the question to the employee, and sometimes employee says, it's in the procedures, but it's technically, logical, not possible. And then managers say, how is this possible? And they're looking at a little bit out of their own comfort zone. And then they see that indeed they have procedures that are not fit for practice, and nobody tells them, because employees are ticking the box and not doing really the training. They say, okay, tick the box. So there's kind of often a parallel world within organizations. So that's what we try to disrupt. So it's an intensive training, it's a multi-level training. And the only way, maybe, because listeners are thinking that is complex, it's complex, but it's brought really user-friendly, because we use a very innovative learning app, that combines all those elements that we've been talking for the past half an hour.
Yeah, maybe to shine some global light on this, I think what you often find in compliance is that people pretend. They sort of file something, but it's an empty document, but they tick the date, they tick the box of filing on time. And obviously, people themselves, they know that they are pretending. And with this setup, you give them a safe channel to not necessarily confess to pretending, but to tell people that they are struggling, and they know that they have a deadline. They know they need to do something, but they don't quite know how to meet it. And so, from an implicit, almost blaming environment, well, why? I mean, you have the information. Why don't you do it? You get into a mutually supportive environment in which people honestly say, "Look, I'm a bit stuck here, and I make no progress." And then the advisor or other people in leadership positions, and then establish exactly what the problem is. And so there is an environment in which collectively the issues get identified and get resolved.
So this naturally lends itself to industries where the consequences of things going wrong are more severe. Because if somebody is going to die as a result of something not happening, or the wrong thing happening, it's much easier for those industries than if I pick, I don't know, banking, where there are societal consequences, but they're nowhere near as obvious. So I'm assuming, based on the case studies that I'm aware of you've worked on, this lends itself naturally to those places where, so health-related industries would be the best example, but I guess safety-critical industries would be another one, where you can't really duck this issue. When it goes wrong, it goes badly wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, that's that. Yes, we've done a lot, but we started now in a new case last week in an organization that is changing from a low cost multinational strategy to a more quality strategy. So people are saying, yeah, instead of looking at quantity, they change into quality. So suddenly, people need to adjust behavior. So you see, when there's really, really important changing of behavior, often organizations see that changing structures or changing the strategy or changing procedures is not the way to change behavior with the people who are doing the work. So often we are not only in a high-risk environment, but when organizations are really and not getting any results on changing the behavior for the people who are doing the work.
So in other words, you're looking at things like we need our organization to be more creative, more entrepreneurial, these sorts of things. So, right. So
For example,
it's the learned behaviors are just not delivering that particular outcome. And that might be something you've always thought you had, but you recognize you haven't. Right. Okay. It's less safety critical, but it is much more about reprogramming people. And I guess in some respects, that must be a bit harder, right? Because safety critical stuff, we all understand it. Nobody wants to go to work in the morning and not make it back. So to a certain extent, the interests are aligned between the organization and the individual. It may not manifest itself in that way, but in theory. But with something like creativity or entrepreneurial behavior, there's less of an alignment there in some cases.
Yeah, maybe it's also, well, Koen can explain it. It's why, for example, in the compliance that we use the compliance 2.0 description of compliance.
Yes, I think you might think compliance and entrepreneurial attitude and behavior, that doesn't really fit. But ultimately, what you find is that with the more conventional approaches to compliance, you basically put people in a straitjacket. And so they fail to deliver against the compliance goals, but you also harm the business because they need to, in order to remain within that straitjacket, make decisions that are perhaps not in line with the long-term business strategy or with the local business unit objectives. So you lose on both sides. And with this approach, and I think going back to the learning is often associated with learning goals, but there are learning goals, but we emphasize the need for behavior goals. So the learning needs not to just lead to more and better insight and better information, better knowledge, but also to different behaviors. And so we ask that people define their own behavioral goals alongside the learning goal. In fact, we've started using the term key behavioral indicators, KBIs, which are the predecessor of key performance indicators. And so the conventional approach is always focus on the ultimate performance without acknowledging the importance of behavior in achieving those performance targets.
So give me an example of that, because I can see. So you're saying a KPI would be something like sales, right? How much have you sold this month?
Yes.
What is a key behavioral indicator in a context where we might traditionally have thought of sales? Or pick something else, but I'm just trying to get a handle on what does that look like?
Yeah. Okay. Well, in sales, a key behavioral indicator could be how frequently or how much you read industry-related information for your customers, so you know the kind of challenges that your customers face and are able to formulate the kind of offerings or solutions that you could offer them.
And then it could be that the first question that we would ask you is, what is your strategy in relation to your sales? So, for example, are your customer intimacy strategy in relation to the sales? Then you need to have people who spend a lot of behavioral, really getting to knowing the customer, instead of a more quantity sales. And so the question is, what is the strategy of your organization? And we try to help managers in translating those KPIs to thinking about, okay, what kind of behaviors are really getting the results that you want? The first question in answering in relation to the strategy.
And so if I looked at what I guess I would term as research, right? Reading stuff to make sure you're, and that might be watching videos, whatever, right? But I'm consuming information so that I have a better sense of what my customers are about. That example you gave, right? How do I measure that? Is it literally taking we find a metric that would apply to that? Is it a case of, I don't know, I'm going to read 20 articles this month? Is that how it works? Or is there
No. It's much more qualitative than quantitative. And I think if you imagine that you're a supervisor and you're a team leader, and you look at the people in your team and you see somebody who basically sits at their desk, just ring up the purchasing manager of a customer, and you see somebody else reading the Economist or reading the Financial Times and sort of clipping things up from what they learn about what is driving the industry sector in which the customer is active and so on. So you can't really quantify that information, like how often have you read the Financial Times this week, but you can spot the behaviors of people who keep on top of what drives their customers, the people in the sector, what keeps them awake at night, what are their medium and long-term challenges, and begin to relate that to how the offering of the organization that they're part of can help their customers face up to those challenges better.
And so it's a bit more subjective, purely how do you measure it?
Well, measure it. It's something that you observe more than measure it. Behavior, you observe behavior rather than measure.
With regard to the self-regulation, I can explain a little bit about those behaviors. So if you start within the intervention and say, okay, you have some goals, targets, KPIs. Okay, think about the behavior that you usually do as an employee to get your indicator. And you want the employees to check their own behavior that leads to some positive or negative result. Give them the exercise to think about new behavior. So you start with of behaviors that you think are successful. Mostly they start with managers telling us. But in a kind of a learning organization, people do the behaviors, make the link for themselves with the indicators, and try to also explain what kind of a behaviors lead to certain results, and then link it to, for example, training that they need to get because certain behaviors they don't know. So in pulling together all those qualitative data, you can get a bigger picture at the end of the intervention of what kind of behaviors are emerging that are really ticking the KPIs at the end of the road. So that's what Koen meant by qualitatively extracting those data. And it's we ask them, so people are reporting it, writing it down in a kind of a diary fashion each week. So we analyze it qualitatively and then try to pinpoint the behaviors at the end of the road that are really driving the.
And so this comes down to, obviously, you have to want to solve the problem. So there will be lots of people for whom this is scary as hell, because you're removing some of the things that one would normally hide behind. Everybody has been trained in this thing. We've done this, we've done that, into a much more customized thing. So I can see it's much more effective, but I could see that it would terrify some managers. The sorts of people who are scared about hybrid working because they haven't got control. Or anybody in that space is not going to like this unless they're forced to, I guess, by reality. So to a certain extent, this is it's going to be self-selecting in some respects, because if you're not up for doing this, it's not going to work.
No, and what we propose, that we create a kind of, let's say, a kind of a playing field, a kind of an incubator, a project that managers indicate where we can try this out. So it's not something that we implement on day one in the full organization, because, as you say, it's scary as hell, and managers don't like it mostly. But if you tell them, okay, you have an issue and it's a wicked problem, it's really coming back to you as a manager, you have heard everything else. Okay, give us a shot, give us a playing field, and have a look, feel how the intervention works. Once you take them into management in the trial, you see that they change also, because they're not standing aside. They're really pulled into the intervention, and a longitudinal road. And at the end, we see that a couple of organizations really think about scaling it to other projects or the full organization.
Is it always obvious what good looks like? Because one of the benefits of traditional metrics is, say, if I'm measuring someone for sales, right, I know they've sold more. I may not be aware of the unintended consequences, which is they've sold inappropriate stuff, they've ripped customers, all that stuff. But I've got something tangible I can handle here. But I'm thinking, and maybe learning is an example where you would know where you have gaps. But things like entrepreneurial or creative thinking, how do we know what good looks like in that context?
Well, I think this emerges from an exercise like this, where you begin with some, let's call them hypotheses, about what behaviors would you hope to see or expect to see in your best salesman. And then you test out whether these behaviors do indeed lead to better performance in the end. And occasionally you will find that it's not quite what you thought. There are some other things that seem to be more powerful drivers of the ultimate quantitative performance. And so that then means you can then begin to describe those behaviors more precisely and ensure that other people begin to adopt those behaviors as well, through training, through osmosis, through social learning, and basically lift everybody up. And in whatever way that sort of more entrepreneurial mindset will be played out in a particular context, that will obviously depend very much on where in the organization you're looking and in what particular industry this organization is active.
I love that in a way, because it's quite a meta thing in a way when you look at it and say, in order to establish what works for entrepreneurial behavior, we need to be entrepreneurial in how we look at it. In other words, you're not shying away from the fact there's an experimental part of this. that's encouraging the experimental piece. So it's almost like it needs to be consistent all the
Absolutely
way through. Because if you had a rigid approach to, it's almost like shouting at people and saying, be more creative, right? It's not going to work. So you have to feed it all the way through, I guess.
Exactly. And I think what you will then find, of course, is that people will observe or learn about how their colleagues go about this and then say, oh, I can probably do something like this, but give it their own particular twist. And so you find you kick off some kind of dynamic in which people, first of all, feel stimulated to be more curious and find out, okay, what kind of behaviors would make my performance better? Look over the shoulders of other people, learn from that, and apply it in their own specific context and matching their own specific personality, for want of a better word, because people will have different ways, different aspects in the job that engages them. To just give a sort of brief example of the compliance project we've been talking about on occasion. So you see people who are poor at timely and completely filing their trial results, then you can make some hypotheses. Well, maybe they have poor diary management or calendar management, or maybe they are passive in obtaining data from the hospitals with which the clinical trials are taking place, or from the vendors that are participating in the trial. And you kind of verify those hypotheses through this process and look at whether it is indeed people who are weak at calendar management or who are comparatively passive and just basically wait until the information is available to file, rather than to chase people and to negotiate about when the information is needed, and then find that different approaches will lead to different outcomes. That's information that can be aggregated, even anonymously, but can be aggregated and fed back to participants in the exercise, and be of relevance and of use to everyone. Okay, all right, this is the way it can be done, and then you can decide whether this requires some kind of formal module on how to negotiate with your trial partners, or whether this is something that is better done through just buddying people up with somebody more experienced, somebody less experienced, to see how this is done, and have some sort of mutual coaching. So we don't really need preconceptions about anything. We just try to identify behaviors that lead to the desired outcome that supports the strategy, and then look at the best ways of making sure that those behaviors are recognized and are adopted by all concerned.
And you mentioned compliance, and we look at sort of regulated industries. I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. One of the things that many regulators like is precisely the opposite of what you're talking about, right? Is the one size fits all standardized thing. It looks the same as what everybody else is doing. What you're proposing here could, if I were a conventional regulator, sound a bit like the Wild Wild West. God, we trust people to work things out for themselves. We're moving away from something that's heavily quantifiable to non-quantifiable. So I could see that in the same way that managers might be fearful of this, I could see regulators being fearful of this as well. What's your experience there? Because obviously if you're working in the compliance space, that's a massive consideration.
Yeah, that's something we took in, and we wrote an article for a Flemish newspaper. It was called "In Organization We Need More Loyal Contrarians." So we are not pleading for total anarchy. We are saying, look, you need procedures, because you need some kind of cognitive rest to do the job, because you need standardization to be creative. So we are not pleading to have no procedures, to have no KPIs. What we are pleading for is, once you have procedures, structures in place, that it doesn't end there. Then you need people who are working with the procedures, the structures, the KPIs, to make them better. In trying out or giving the freedom, the trust, that they can try out new things, of course, in a responsible way, in a self-regulated way, so that they can give input. If the environment changes, then you know that the procedures that were created in another environment won't give the results the regulators want. So you need people who are more contrarian, who think more entrepreneurial, who have a self-regulated modus. Because the environment wherein we operate, and COVID was a really interesting period where we saw that all procedures and standards that we had in place didn't fit anymore. Because when we told I think it was 2018, and a lot of people gave us the same feedback as you just did, Christian. And they said, yeah, we have everything in place and it's all fine. And no, we don't need entrepreneurial entrepreneurs. We just need people who do the job as in the procedures. And then regulators are satisfied. And then came COVID. So then you need people who chase that from doing the job. So it's a kind, and Koen referred, I think Koen, you wrote an article on it, on polarity thinking. So that's our answer when we get this kind of response. Yeah, we don't throw everything away. We just put something new into it as a polarity. Push towards polarity thinking, even in compliance. That's why we say compliance 2.0, meaning, yes, do the work and start with doing the work as is prescribed, as regulators want, but also make sure that there is a flexibility, psychological safety to experiment and to do it better.
Yeah. And I think maybe to just say a little bit more about these about polarities, because not everybody may be familiar with the term. Polarity thinking is a concept that was formulated by a guy called Barry Johnson quite some time ago, and it effectively identifies the kind of problem whereby you cannot really make a trade-off between two things. A bit more of this means a bit less of that. And Christian, I think what you were alluding to is that there is a risk, or at least a perceived risk, that the conditions that are embodied in the compliance requirements are being sacrificed for something else. And that clearly is not on. But the whole issue can be reduced to, at the same time, therefore both one and the other, at the same time, meeting the requirements of, say, the FDA, in this case, in the case of a pharmaceutical company or a medical equipment company, and simultaneously with the business objectives. So the whole idea is, how can you meet those two goals without sacrificing one or the other? And so our approach is aimed at meeting those boundary conditions and meeting the requirements for compliance as required, without sacrificing the broader business objectives. So it's not, okay, well, I'll just need to spend 2 days filing my documentation and everything else will have to wait. So it's allowing people to manage their environment and manage their work in such a way that they do not need to sacrifice one for the other. And I think in the sense that the regulator might get nervous about this, I don't think that is necessary at all, because basically what we do not do is put at risk the meeting of their requirements. What we do is help people find and discover and embrace a way of working in which they can meet those requirements better than they do now. Because at the moment, what you see is that people pretend they file something, but it's not complete, and hope that nobody will notice until later. So we want them to work as required and deliver what is required without sacrificing anything else. That is what we're aiming for.
And what I think is really interesting is when we look at compliance, it's sort of like, well, we want people to follow the rules. But clearly the reason we have rules and processes in place is that the individual in certain situations has enough agency to not do it. Because if they had no agency, you wouldn't need to impose these rules on them. So we are working with that dynamic, whether we want to admit it or not. And so I quite like this idea of embracing the whole thing and saying, you know what, and I particularly where there's a qualitative component, I like what you're saying, because then it's basically, well, actually, we'll recognize the dynamics here, that humans have the capability to do things we don't want them to do or not do things that we do. So let's just embrace that, right? That's a feature. So we can take that and start to say, okay, recognizing that that is going to be there, How do we enhance, how do we get the best out of that dynamic rather than wishing it away?
I think that's very well put. I think people have imagination and agency. They can deviate from whatever they are being told to do. And it is what they do. Only they do it under the radar. And what we say is, why not use that capacity of imaginative thinking to basically do what you need to do, but do it much better? And I think that's something that seems to work in the vast majority of cases.
And the other thing I really liked about what you were saying is it sort of fits into my world, where I look at human risk as a very negative formulation, which is people are the biggest unit of risk in your organization. They need to be controlled. The flip side of that, which I call human reward, is just because risk and reward sort of seen as opposites, not because I think it's the best possible term, is how do we get the best out of people? I don't mean the most, I mean the best. We've hired them for a reason. And the interplay between those two things is, if you over control the world, you don't get the human reward side. Equally, if you unleash the human reward and go, do what the hell you like, right? Then you're going to have problems on the other side. And I think what you're talking about here beautifully recognizes that it's almost a little bit like a seesaw, in that if one side goes up, the other side goes down. It's not quite that simple, but that's the imagery I have in my primitive brain. And so I think what's interesting here is you're working with a dynamic that actually, if we were honest about it, and that's what I like about this, there's a fundamental honesty to what you're saying, is let's take the realities of the world, which plays into the whole behavioral science thing, right? We're designing a solution that is based on real people in the real world making real decisions, as opposed to theoretical decisions that they ought to be making. We're looking at the ones they actually make.
Exactly. And I think as a metaphor for the polarity thinking, the seesaw, I prefer riding a bike. You can't sort of define what the position of equilibrium is for a bike when you're riding a bike. I mean, some people can do, as they say in French, a surplus, but most people only can stay upright on a bike on occasion. And that is how we see this effectively playing out. The constraints that are being imposed on us, okay, well, they are not negotiable, but why not use our mental and intellectual resources, decision-making resources, to make the choices that serve those regulatory requirements and serves the strategy of our business.
Got it. Amazing. Gentlemen, as I knew would happen, time has just flown past. But before I let you go, tell my listeners how they can get hold of you. They're interested in finding out more. They want you to come into their organization to help them. How can they find you?
So we have a website, the then they can find all information.
Excellent. Well, that's nice and simple. I will put a link to that in the show notes. I think what you're doing is super interesting, and I love the way that you're approaching it. And I think in a world where we're striving for authenticity and sustainable solutions and all those kinds of things, it sits neatly within all that piece. So I've really enjoyed listening to you. You've prompted a whole load of thoughts that I'm going to take away from this. But thank you so much, one, for spending the time sharing, and secondly, being great guests on the show.
Yep. Thanks very much, Christian. It's been great. Lovely.
Thanks for having us.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening, and to Koen and Bart for appearing. To find out more about them, their consultancy, The Bee, and their book, The Entrepreneurial Organization, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. And if you're not already following Koen on social media, now is your opportunity. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do leave a review for the show, as it helps others to find it. And to discover episodes that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay safe. Perhaps think about solving some of the wicked problems in your organization by using behavioral science. And if you need some help, we know some people that can do that. But above all, thank you so much for listening.